Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And first of all, thank you for listening.
We love what we get to do, and we love that you listen to us. And
well, not everything we get to do, but pretty much.
Well, this. And I've
Yes,
met
sir.
some people who say, I love the podcast introduction. That's what I really most enjoy about the program. And then I meet people who say, for goodness sake, can you just get on with the program, you know? And so, they're sometimes the same person.
If you listen on the radio, you don't hear the podcast.
You miss this
intro.
richness of pitter-patter.
And if you listen on the radio, you also get to hear what would Jefferson do.
Which, by the way, not everyone hears, but this week it was about Greenland. What do you know?
But you can find, every week, you can find the What Would Jefferson Do segment on our website at jeffersonhour.com.
We love the correspondence we get. We love the questions, sometimes the criticism, where we answer all the mail. We incorporate as much of it as we possibly can. And at popular request, we created the Jefferson Hour Book Club, and we've gone through a number of books this year.
Yes, and I think next up is Robinson Crusoe, isn't it?
Oh, thank goodness.
Why?
Because I love that book almost more than all other books.
Really?
Yeah. And I can't wait to talk about that. So everyone, please read Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. You know the story, of course. Marooned on the island, has to learn how to do everything for himself. Eventually meets this native person that he decides to call Friday, and so on and so forth. It's based on the life of a man named Alexander von Selkirk. But anyway.
Oh, that's right. You know, and we had talked at one point about sort of double dipping on that book club selection. I don't know that that's really a good thing to do, but I would recommend, if anybody's very interested, in reading a book titled Selkirk's Island, which is really fun.
It's a great book about the
somebody
background.
goes to the island and lives there and finds out what
I don't think he was a
probably would've
von
gone through.
Selkirk, by the way. I think he was Alexander Selkirk. But yes.
Oh, did I say
I know
von?
I did. And so
okay.
I'm just correcting myself. But
You have von Humboldt on your
right,
brain.
von Humboldt, von Selkirk.
Right.
So that book is an incredible book. And as you know, our friend Russ Eagle of Carolina, I sent him that pea, and then he had to make that one pea proliferate over, and he's had some setbacks, but he still has about I'd say a pint of peas.
Well, you know, I'm doing the same this year. I like to get seeds from Seed Saver Exchange in Dakota, Iowa. A little plug. They're a nonprofit. They're a great place. And I got some this year. I saw the name of the seed, and I had to. It was Swenson's Swedish peas.
And how were they?
They were great, and I'm letting the last of them sort of dry out. I've been saving. I've already started saving tomato seeds.
Is Swenson a Swedish word?
It's the son of Sven. You get?
But it could be Norwegian.
No, gosh, no.
Swedish. So
Certainly
excuse
not.
me. Didn't mean to offend your sense of
Norway's not really
Swedish
even
nationalism.
a country. They don't have a king. They borrowed one.
Yeah.
I'm married to a full-blood Norwegian, so I know these things. Yes.
So Alexander von Humboldt was a exact contemporary of Lewis and Clark.
Just joking.
He came to visit Thomas Jefferson at the White House in May and June of 1800. He was in this country May and June of 1804. That was just the time when Lewis and Clark were starting out from St. Charles, moving up the Missouri River.
And in the book, there's a great little segment about what if they could have met, how much it would have meant to Lewis and Clark and Jefferson and Humboldt and all, how they could have helped one another.
If Humboldt had come a year earlier, I feel absolutely certain Jefferson would have said, what would it take?
You got to go.
What would it take for you to do this? And Jefferson
I
would
thought
have
of
said,
that
we
too.
will find a way.
I thought of that
Poor
too.
Lewis would have been third lieutenant.
Yeah, well, that would have been all right, though.
But-
I mean, Lewis probably would have been a lot happier. He didn't like all that pressure of
Well,
leadership.
plus Humboldt was the real item. He eventually wrote 20 books.
That would have been a great combo.
Oh, think of that, Humboldt and
Clark
Lewis
out there
expedition.
being the football coach, making sure things got done, the Army officer, Lewis getting to daydream and just
Be the romantic.
and find those things, and then Humboldt doing the hard work of categorizing. And,
Well, Lewis would come back. I mean, Lewis was a terrific field naturalist. He'd come back and say, here's a plant. And then Humboldt would say, allow me. And then he'd go into the whole Linnaean thing.
We do touch on this in the show a bit about Humboldt's actual journals, and I know you can get them. I think you can even get them on Amazon for nothing or maybe $1. And it's not like you want to sit and read all of them, but it's just great fun to read a little bit of them. It really is.
So this book is Sandra Rebok, Humboldt and Jefferson, A Transatlantic Friendship of the Enlightenment. And a couple of things. It's only 212 or so
a short
pages.
book, yeah.
But the appendix, the last chunk of it, is the complete correspondence between Humboldt and Jefferson, which is in itself a fascinating thing.
Just to have it all collected and connected.
And here's what I love so much about it. Jefferson appears not to have known who Alexander Humboldt was until Humboldt wrote him. The minute he met him, he realized, oh, my, I want to know this guy. And then they corresponded for the rest of their lives.
Decades, right.
And Jefferson regarded Humboldt as like the most serious Enlightenment scientific figure in the world. Would have loved to have seen more of him. Jefferson would have given anything to get Humboldt to come down to Monticello. But when Humboldt went back to Europe, his orientation was towards the east.
5 years, yeah.
Right. He never came back to the Western Hemisphere.
Fun show. We hope you enjoy it. Fun book. We hope you will read it if you're so inclined. Before we go to the show, I need to remind you that, how do I put it? We need your support. We always do, and we appreciate your support. There are many of you who have joined the 1776 Club, and we can't thank you enough for that. So if you'd like to support the show, we would appreciate it. We take nothing for this. We accept abuse and compliments. And you beg for
well, that's the
you got to stop.
I wanted to bring that up because I was
beg for
I
gifts
was with one of our dear friends horse camping, and he said to me, does that begging thing really work? Because, it's kind of annoying.
Yeah.
And I said, not well enough.
I like
not
this
well
guy.
Enough. Not
Anyway,
well enough.
if you are so inclined and you would like to support the show, we really do appreciate it.
And I'm just joking about the begging. Not.
Yeah. Go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. And, if you're not in a position where you want to donate to the show, write us a letter. Ask President Jefferson a question. That counts. It keeps us on our toes. And so thank you so much. Now, do you have anything you want to beg for or pitch?
I want to pitch two things.
Okay.
This is not pitching.
Of course it is.
This is opportunity.
That's just a classy pitch.
We have 10 more days to join the France trip, and we have 4 places left. A trip of trips.
Well, today is...
I know, but we have 10 days.
Okay.
You can still join the France trip, but you've got to call now. I can't wait. I've been reading about Jefferson in France. This is going to be fantastic. But the 2 winter retreats at Lochsa Lodge west of Missoula, and people say, who would want to go in the winter? It's like a winter wonderland. It's like a Currier and Ives painting. It's like the mildest possible time. There's snow, but it's all shoveled. You're drinking hot chocolate and rum toddies. Amazing. So there are 2 this winter. One is on Charles Dickens. That's 18 through 23 January. And we have just 6 places left on the Dickens seminar, 4 novels. And the other one is just before that. And it is the American Space Program. And we only have 4 places left on that. Anyway, Dickens is the first one. Go to the website, jeffersonhour.com/tours.
Yeah, you can find out everything.
Then the
there.
American Space Program. And we're going to have a Dickens Christmas meal.
Oh, nice.
Including punch.
Will it be edible?
Oh, my. It'll be the best thing you ever ate. Okay. And then we're going to have like
porridge and such?
No. Turkey and leek and potato soup and sherried prawns.
Okay, let's go to the show.
And then on the
you've taken way more
on
time
the space
pitching
program,
than I did.
We're doing space ice cream, Tang, the energy drink.
Jeez,
Velcro. You get a little piece of Velcro. So go to the website. Now's the time to sign up.
I'm
France,
sure it'll be great.
October 17th. Space program, and then Dickens at Lochsa Lodge in January in a winter wonderland west of Missoula, Montana. And it ends each time with a soak in one of the most beautiful hot springs in North America.
As always, we are your humble servants. Please enjoy this week's show, and thank you for listening. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Seated across from me now is Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I bring you greetings from all of your fans around this country.
Thank you so much. I'm blushing, as you can see. This week, we are going to rejoin the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club, and perhaps you could tell our listeners what book it is you have selected.
Humboldt and Jefferson, A Transatlantic Friendship of the Enlightenment by Sandra Rebok. And I'll tell you why, David. James Rhonda, the great Lewis and Clark scholar, in my opinion, the greatest Lewis and Clark scholar.
I know you're a fan of his. You have been for a long time.
From the minute I read his book, he published his really remarkable and seminal book, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, back in 1984. And it was the first book that reversed the lens and looked at the Lewis and Clark expedition from native eyes. Now, he's not a Native American, but he is an extraordinary scholar and historian. And he said, what if you looked at this story from their point of view rather than simply looking at it from a Eurocentric point of view? And this book was a revolution. Later on in his career, when he became the central scholar of the Lewis and Clark world and gave, by the way, a truly magnificent keynote speech at the first of the national signature events. You were there at Monticello in January of 2003 on the 200th anniversary of the launching by Jefferson in a letter to Congress of the Lewis and Clark expeditions. And in that great speech, he said Lewis and Clark is America's first great road story. It's a masterful understanding that we now have of this story, but he said the next step is to get out of the river and look at a larger world, the world of Alexander Mackenzie, the world of Captain Cook, the world of Freeman and Custis, who were exploring the Red River, the world of Dunbar.
And David Thompson.
David Thompson and Zebulon Pike, and later on John C. Fremont, and so on. He said comparative exploration, and particularly comparative exploration for explorers that Lewis and Clark referred to or whose work they were borrowing from, as in Alexander Mackenzie, is the essential next step. Well, this is such a great story, as you know. Alexander von Humboldt was a Prussian, was a German. He was young enough to be Jefferson's son. He had spent 5 years in Latin and Central America doing work of monumental importance. He was on his way back to Paris, to Europe, was in Mexico and Cuba, and he diverted his crossing to go back to Europe to come to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. And for what? Because he wanted to meet this philosopher prince, this man of the Enlightenment who was presiding over the American Republic, Thomas Jefferson. And so this is happening at precisely the same time that Lewis and Clark were heading up the Missouri River. Humboldt came to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. in May and June of 1804. And as we all know, Lewis and Clark left St. Charles, Missouri on May 14th, 1804. So you have these sort of parallel worlds out in the West. Lewis and Clark have begun their 2.5-year ascent, their ascent of the Missouri, their crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains, and their descent of tributaries of the Snake and the Columbia. At the same time, having spent 5 years doing an equally impressive, in some ways more impressive, set of explorations and scientific studies in Central and South America, this young genius, Alexander von Humboldt, diverts his return journey to Europe for the purpose and the sole purpose of meeting Jefferson.
You know, I thought the book's title was great because it's very simple and straight, and it connects the two men, and I really enjoyed that. I didn't know what to expect from this book, but I appreciated all of the correspondence that she references, and the fact that there's a lot of it in the appendix of the book.
And so she wisely collected all the known correspondence between Humboldt and Jefferson. There are probably 12 letters altogether that we have, and she placed it in the appendix of this volume, Humboldt and Jefferson, A Transatlantic Friendship of the Enlightenment. And so you can go there and you can read this really beautiful exchange between this older, extremely well-educated man who did not know of Humboldt until he met him.
I really enjoyed her dissemination of the letters, the way she explained what she thought they meant, and I think for the most part, she was right on about it.
Oh, she's good, and it's a really interesting book about two really interesting people, and I'll tell you this story that is my favorite Humboldt story. My favorite story about Humboldt and Jefferson. He did what Lewis never did. He went back after all of this, and he published 20 volumes. 20 volumes of his findings with lavish illustrations and with charts and vocabularies. And he was an extraordinary man. He was Lewis on steroids, Lewis if he were a highly educated genius.
It's really fun to read those, too. I was so inspired by the book that I actually went and found. There's 3 volumes that I think you can get for free as ebooks of his personal narrative of travels to this, what is it, equinoctial regions of America?
Equinoctial regions,
Thank you for that. And it's really fun to, you were saying earlier, you made a comment about maybe as important or more important than Lewis and Clark. If Jefferson had received something from Lewis akin to what Humboldt, he would have been so pleased. But his writing is great fun. There's a section that I found, and he writes, "We're reposing on the banks of the lake to enjoy the soft freshness of the air in one of those beautiful evenings peculiar to the tropics. It is delightful to contemplate in the waves as they beat the shore the reflection of the red fires that illuminate the horizon." And it's, that's kind of like the tone. Now, I don't know about the translation, how accurate it is, but it can't be that far off.
Oh, and so Humboldt had what Lewis didn't, which is the ready capacity to write. He didn't seem to have any writer's block. He was a prolific and ready penman, and more importantly, to defend Lewis for a moment, he had the European infrastructure of publishing, illustration, map making, printing, dissemination, a larger republic of letters, a larger scientific community, more to lean on. And so in the course of his time after his North American and South American period, he was able to publish these 20 volumes because it was possible to do so. When Lewis tried to do his own much more modest thing, 3 volumes in Philadelphia, we don't know quite what went wrong, but a generous way to look on it is that America did not yet have the intellectual infrastructure, the publishing infrastructure, all those industries and sub-industries that allow you to do a 20-volume folio report of a journey. That was not yet in place in this country. Philadelphia was the intellectual capital of the United States. It was the second city of the British Empire. But you could do it in London, as Captain Cook learned. You could do it in Prussia or Paris, as Humboldt found. But it was a little premature to try to do something as ambitious as what Jefferson had in mind and Lewis attempted to fulfill following his return in 1806.
Well, Humboldt's was that ambitious, and I just wanted to read that little chunk because it's not all just charts and graphs of temperature changes, and there's a lot of personality of him within his writings. I don't know. Actually, when this was published, do you?
It took decades. It was the rest of his life.
Do we know if Jefferson ever read any of?
We don't know that Jefferson read any, although he says he does in this correspondence. But Humboldt would then send him volumes, and so he'd say, "I've just sent you my latest 2 volumes." And I'm sure Jefferson thought, "Wow, Lewis couldn't write a single volume. Here's Humboldt, who is sending me volume after volume, and he's turning this around year after year." But here's what this is really important for me to talk about, David, is Lewis's character and Lewis's spiritual life. For whatever reason, when Meriwether Lewis came back in 1806, he couldn't do it. He couldn't write the book. He couldn't pull off the multi-volume publication report. And part of that was what I've been saying, that the United States and Philadelphia weren't yet quite ready for that. But part of it was Lewis. And when Humboldt, about the same age, goes back to Paris and to Europe, I won't say effortlessly, but it looks effortless, that for year after year for the rest of his life, he was able to do this, to write, to find illustrators, to find cartographers, to use his own drawings, to create his own charts. And he had, whatever that was, the right stuff to do that. And that's what an explorer is supposed to do. From the point of view of Joseph Banks or Thomas Jefferson, the journey isn't over until the book has been written. And Lewis failed at this for whatever reason, and it has to be seen as a failure. It can't be. There's no excuse. We love the story so much. We love the story of Lewis and Clark among the Indians and the river and finding the source and all the Sacagawea and all the adventures and mishaps and getting lost and having encounters with grizzly bears and so on. We find all that so lovely, entertaining, and compelling that we forget that he didn't produce the multi-volume Enlightenment report that was essential as the capstone and conclusion of this journey. And so when you compare young Humboldt, who effortlessly and masterfully wrote up his results, and then Lewis, who was a gifted man who couldn't do it, it gives you a very stark contrast, and it's the kind of thing that Rhonda urged us to do. In other words, you learn something about Lewis by looking at Humboldt.
What you call it comparative exploration.
Comparative exploration, exactly. And so I love this story.
Me too.
And I love the fact that it was simultaneous. That while Humboldt is at the White House, Lewis and Clark are just beginning their long journey up the Missouri.
Yeah, and she talks in the book how it's unfortunate that they hadn't met before they left, but we need to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to center, if we can, on the differences and the similarities between Jefferson and Humboldt, and a lot of the book is devoted to that.
Indeed, and I would like to talk about this famous incident that occurred in the White House during that meeting.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week we're into the Jefferson Hour Book Club, and we're discussing Jefferson and Humboldt by Sandra Rebok.
Interesting book. She's a fellow at the Huntington. This is a relatively short book. I urge everyone to take a look at it. Sandra Rebok, Humboldt and Jefferson, A Transatlantic Friendship of the Enlightenment.
I had asked that we might be able to talk a bit about the similarities and differences between Jefferson and Humboldt, but you wanted to relate your favorite story from the White House when they met.
So he writes to Jefferson and says this lovely, lovely letter that's in the book, in the appendix, and he says, I'm on my way back to Europe after this long sojourn that I've had in Mexico and South America. And he said, but I want to present my respects and to express my great admiration for your writings, your actions, and the liberalism of your ideas, which have inspired me from my earliest youth. That's the first paragraph of his letter.
Yeah, and I think she really dissects that well. It's a carefully written, what's the right word, very complimentary letter to get into Jefferson's good graces and also make him anxious to meet with Humboldt.
Oh, and listen to this. This comes later in the letter. So he describes some of his travels and says, maybe you've seen some of my early scholarly work. And it turns out Jefferson didn't really know of him up to this point. But then he says this, and think of it. He's been gone for 5 full years from Europe in the wildest country of the Western Hemisphere. And then he says, in spite of my burning desire to return to Paris, where I had long worked and where we now hope to publish our works and fruits of this expedition, I could not resist the moral interest to see the United States and to enjoy the comforting aspect of a people which understands the precious gift of liberty. I wish it were possible for me to present my personal respects and admiration to you and to admire in you a philosopher magistrate who has gained the approval of 2 continents.
But done like a real gentleman, but
also true.
Hint,
also
hint,
true.
hint.
And so Jefferson writes back to him and says, well, I'm kind of in this embarrassing situation, Mr. Humboldt, because although I would love to meet you and you sound fascinating and I'm really wanting to know more about what you've learned, we moved the capital to this place, Washington, and there's nothing here. There are no restaurants. There are no wine bars. There are no bookshops. There are really no hotels. It's kind of a howling wilderness here. It's going to be great at some future date, but for the moment, really, there's nothing here that we have to offer you, but if you'd like to come, we'll make it work. And so Jefferson's kind of getting his comeuppance for moving the capital from Philadelphia to the District of Columbia. But so he says in this kind of embarrassed way, you who have lived in Berlin and Paris are going to find it a little raw here. So Humboldt arrives in Philadelphia, where Charles Wilson Peale, Jefferson's friend and the first great museum director of the country and the famous painter, takes him under his wing, and they spend some time in Philadelphia, and they gather up this group of people, and they come on this 3-day journey from Philadelphia to D.C., where they stay in a hotel. And Humboldt has 3 or 4 encounters with Jefferson. He has dinner with Madison. I mean, he's treated extremely well, and everyone is just fascinated by him. And Dolly Madison says, all the women of the district are in love with him, and they hang on his every word, and he talks faster than anyone I've ever met, and he's just full of things to say, and everyone is just enamored of him. He's just like the talk of the town. Well, anyway, he spends some time with Jefferson, and Jefferson is actually mostly interested in Texas because Humboldt has had the chance in Mexico City to look at archives that no American would ever be allowed to look at. And Jefferson's big concern is, what is the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase? Is it the Red River? Is it the Rio Grande? Is it the Sabine River? Jefferson wants all of Texas. The Spanish want Jefferson to get none of what became Texas. Jefferson doesn't even really know what he's talking about, but he knows that Humboldt knows. And so they spent a lot of time debriefing this man about what he learned in these archives and what he knows about the geography of this sort of porous border between the U.S. and New Spain. But here's the story. Humboldt is waiting for Jefferson somewhere in the White House. Jefferson's in a meeting or doing something. And he finds this newspaper sitting on this stand, on this bureau of some sort, and he idly picks it up. And it's a newspaper with a scathing attack on Jefferson, just a vicious Federalist attack on everything Jefferson stands for, that he's a Jacobin, that he's irresponsible, that he's a slaveholder, that he's wholly unfit for the presidency, that he was a coward during the war, and so on. And finally Jefferson comes out after his meeting, and Humboldt says to him, "How can this be? How can you permit this? Why is this person allowed to write what he has written about you?" And then Jefferson allows there to be a stage pause. And he says, take that newspaper and slip it into your pocket. And when you go back to the old world and they ask you what liberty and freedom are, show them that.
I love that story, too.
Isn't that cool?
There's another one that popped up. You mentioned Charles Wilson Peale, which I thought it was just a short bit about him, which kind of gives you an insight to what sort of gentleman Humboldt was. He commented in his diaries, "The Baron spoke English very well in the German dialect. Here I shall take notice that he possessed a surprising fluency of speech, and it was amusing to hear him speak English, French, and the Spanish languages, mixing them together in rapid speech." And I thought that was pretty interesting.
So he's speaking in a polyglot way, several different languages.
I get this image of this guy who's just kind of lost, and he's so excited to exchange ideas that he just lets go and doesn't think about it.
And he really is with the Enlightenment. Madison, Gallatin. Gallatin was one of the pioneers of knowing Native American languages and helping to classify Indian languages. Jefferson is a genius, and he really is a philosopher prince who happens now to be the president of the United States. And Madison is no slouch. He's the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights. So,
he's in the thick of it.
Humboldt's been alone out there in the middle of nowhere for a long, long time. Suddenly he has someone to talk to.
Before we get away from it, though, back to the information about Mexico, I thought that was very interesting, too, because it's almost like a little bit of espionage
it is. It's
going on.
Geopolitical spying.
Right, yeah.
Because there's no way that the Spanish were going to allow
not to say they didn't like
Americans.
the guy and respect him, but they went, ooh, we can get some inside info.
Well, Jefferson's view is knowledge is power, and here's this guy who has it. And remember that the Spanish sent out 3 intercept missions to cut off Lewis and Clark. They arrested Zebulon Pike somewhere in southern Colorado and took him all the way to Chihuahua. They were obsessed with the problem that the United States was going to grab New Mexico from them, everything we eventually did grab, the Arizona, California, New Mexico Texas corridor, they were absolutely obsessed that the United States had designs on that part of the world, which in fact we did.
Yeah.
And we eventually did take, and they wanted to prevent this. And so they were holding the line diplomatically that the border of the Louisiana Purchase was the Sabine River, which is now the east coast of Texas. And they were terrified that Lewis and Clark or somebody else were going to go towards Santa Fe. We're going to penetrate the heart of New Mexico. And Lewis had actually written to Jefferson during his time coming down the Ohio saying, winter's a long time in St. Louis. Maybe I'll make a horseback journey down to Santa Fe. And when Jefferson got that letter, he wrote back instantly to Lewis. He would have telegrammed him or texted him if he could have. But Jefferson wrote back instantly to Lewis and said, no, your mission is single. You are not to go on any filibustering excursions down into the Southwest. Your mission is to explore the Missouri River and the Northwest region of the Louisiana Purchase, because Jefferson knew this is really serious border tension. And so here's Alexander von Humboldt, who has been allowed into the Mexican archives, who knows a good deal about this, who's actually been in Cuba, who spent a lot of time in Mexico, and he now is able to give information to the Yankees, to the Americans, that they could not have gotten in any other way. As you say, that wasn't their thrill in knowing him, but they weren't about to let him get away without doing all that.
There weren't really any designs on South America by Jefferson or others beyond wanting knowledge of them, was there?
Except he wanted Texas, and we didn't get it. Jefferson thought that in the long run we would take all of Central America too. But here's another thing, David. Going back to the letters, they had this exchange, and this one's 1809, so this is 5 years later.
Well, I think we should set that up a little bit. I mean, they only met for 3 days.
A couple of meetings over a couple of days.
And that was it. But their correspondence...
Then they corresponded forever.
For decades.
Right. And Jefferson immediately realized, this is exactly my kind of guy. And he doesn't say it, but it's like, I wish Lewis had been this kind of a guy.
I'm sure he did, yeah.
But he said, this guy knows everything. He's wired into the European world. He has seen the Americas. He's a prolific writer. He loves the very kind of world that I, Thomas Jefferson, live in. I'm gonna correspond with him. And they do for the rest of their lives. But here's this letter that Humboldt writes to Jefferson in 1809. So Jefferson is already retired. He's back at Monticello. Unfortunately, Humboldt never got to see Monticello. But he says this at the end of a letter about a whole bunch of different things. Now I have a request to make of you. We are already 12,000 leagues apart. He was thinking of maybe going off to Kashmir, so I might even be further away. He says, now, I possess your excellent work on Virginia. Jefferson's only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. I possess your excellent work on Virginia, but should like to receive it from your own hands with a line of your handwriting. It would be a very precious memento. You made me a gift of your own copy of Playfair, but your name is not in it, and I am afraid of this public misery, which divides everything into lines into of red or blue. Please do not decline my request. Madame de Tessé, whom Jefferson knew in France, who is devoted to you as I am, says that my request is quite reasonable. All right, so he says basically, I have a copy of Notes on Virginia, and I benefited mightily from it, but I would like one signed by you.
By the author, right.
And so Jefferson does it. He gets the letter and he signs it. And David, when Jefferson signed a book, it wasn't Best Regards Jefferson. Jefferson, I've seen these in the archives at the University of Virginia and at Monticello. When Jefferson signed a book, he wrote an essay. To the great Alexander von Humboldt, whom I had the pleasure of entertaining after his monumental trip to, and who has made so many signal contributions. I regret that this book is so imperfect. There are many mistakes in it. You will forgive them. They were the work of haste. But I hope that in some ways it helps to lay the groundwork for a better understanding. That's what Jefferson would do. He'd write these essays.
That's great.
So he sent that book to Humboldt. And here's what I want to do. I want to find that book. Humboldt's library is not all in one place, but his library, at least parts of it, still exists. He blended it with his brother. That book might be out there.
I don't know if Americans, and this is something we could get into, but I don't know if Americans understand just how famous Humboldt is in Europe. There's another book we've talked about, The Invention of Nature, which kind of goes into
Andrea
that.
Wolfe, who wrote about. But imagine this book. This book
just
probably
just
still
to
exists.
reinforce your point that it probably still exists because there's so much research devoted to him in Europe.
If that book still exists, and I think it probably does, it might be capable of being found. And if it were found, it's at least within the realm of possibilities that it would be gifted to the Library of Congress or gifted to Monticello. Probably not, but it would be scanned.
Do you know what that would be? That would be a great cultural tour. Clay Jenkinson and the search for.
Well, you got to make sure you're going to find it.
Yeah.
You remember when they went down to see the Titanic and nothing there, or when they went to the bottom of Lake Tahoe and nothing there. But if we could find that book, this would be one of the greatest discoveries in Jefferson studies, and I believe it's out there. And I know that if Jefferson sent that book, he did not just write yours truly, Thomas Jefferson.
Right. Yeah. Be
anyway,
interesting. Yeah.
So, and then he finally gets it, and there's this long talk back and forth, and I thank you so much. And then he said, this is what Humboldt says in 1810. So now Jefferson is safely retired. Remember, he never got to Charlottesville. He's writing from Paris, where he did his publications, not in Germany. My thoughts often turn to Monticello, and I picture under the peaceful shade of a magnolia the statesman who has established the happiness of an entire world. Tears come to my eyes when I think that the most virtuous of men is also the happiest. For what can equal the happiness that you, sir, must feel, surrounded by hardworking, enterprising citizens worthy of the liberty which you have achieved and preserved for them?
I enjoy this kind of book so much because for me, it's always understanding the character of men, and this book really aids in that, and understanding Jefferson better, and understanding Humboldt.
Here's what I love about Jefferson. When he found an interesting person, he embraced that person and tried to collect that person.
He absorbed them, really.
And he knew that, he says in his famous biographical sketch of Lewis from 1813, he says, he was so committed to the truth, such a fine observer, that anything he wrote about what he saw out there, you could count on as if you had seen it yourself.
They did not always agree, however.
Humboldt and Jefferson.
Right, yeah, and slavery is the one that pops out, and that was a tough back and forth. They were both gentlemen about it.
He never confronted Jefferson about it.
Yeah, he never really did, no.
So that's the thing that I've always said about this, and this confirms it, that everyone got it, that here was this liberty-loving, extraordinary genius, this America's Renaissance man, America's figure of the Enlightenment, who by any standard measure should be the most principled opponent of slavery. And yet, Jefferson was not only deeply complicit in slavery, but he was in some regards an apologist for slavery. It soon became clear to everyone that you never actually confronted Jefferson about this. And Humboldt talked to other people while he was in Washington, D.C., and said that slavery was an abomination, an appalling affront to human right, and he couldn't believe that this could still exist and that it could exist in the United States of America. But when he was with Jefferson, he tactfully did not confront the great man about this. It's pretty interesting.
And there it was right in front of him in Notes on the State of Virginia. So it is interesting. I think your assessment is right on.
And so then later, he wrote this book that he sends to Jefferson, in which, this is after 1808, so he sends one of his many volumes to Jefferson, and in it there was
the apology?
The attack on slavery.
Right. Yeah.
So in it there's this really serious attack on American slavery. And then he says, I just want to apologize for this.
Yeah.
He said, I know that in 1808 your administration passed this bill outlawing the slave trade, and
he goes through the whole list.
I couldn't take it back. And
right. But in future volumes,
I will correct this. But he's apologizing.
But he never did.
Of course not. He's apologizing to Jefferson for nailing America on the question of slavery, and he's giving Jefferson the only out that he can give him, which is, I know you did some things during your administration that I wasn't able to account for. That's how much respect he had for Jefferson, that he I'm sure he believed 100% what he had written in his assault on slavery, but he also felt the need to assuage Jefferson's chagrin or whatever negative feeling Jefferson might have in reading that. And he said, I'm just so sorry. If I could do it over again, I might not print that.
Margaret Bayard Smith gives us so many good descriptions of Jefferson and others, and she wrote about Humboldt that he formed not his estimate of men and manners by their clothing and conventionalisms, and refined as were his tastes and polished as were his manners. He was neither shocked or disgusted, as was the case with the British minister, by the old-fashioned form, ill-chosen colors, or simple material of the president's dress. I just bring that up because it sort of reinforces that he judged people by who they were rather than their station in life, and I'm sure that's true.
But it also shows that Jefferson really was a shabby dresser,
that
and
too.
that Margaret Bayard Smith felt the need to kind of say, we get it, that he's weird, he's eccentric, he's wearing old-style clothes, he's not fashionable, but he never brought attention to this.
But he's a good guy.
He liked Jefferson in spite of the weird way that Jefferson dressed.
We need to take a short break, Clay, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm out of character this week. I'm in actual human street clothes, trousers, a button-down shirt. So Mr. Jefferson is not here this time. David, this book is so interesting.
It is.
Sandra Rebok's book, Humboldt and Jefferson, A Transatlantic Friendship of the Enlightenment. I want to read a little passage from a letter that Jefferson wrote to Humboldt, a long letter, in fact, December 6th, 1813. Context: Jefferson has just written the biographical sketch of Lewis that will appear in the Biddle Allen first edition of Lewis and Clark, the one where he says of courage undaunted and with a fidelity to truth and all that stuff, that beautiful tribute to Lewis. But here's what Jefferson says to Humboldt, same time, at the end of 1813, about Lewis. Remember, the expedition got back in September of 1806. This is now 1813. Jefferson: you will find it inconceivable that Lewis's journey to the Pacific should not yet have appeared, nor is it in my power to tell you the reason. The measures taken by his surviving companion Clark for the publication have not answered our wishes in point of dispatch. I think, however, from what I have heard, that the Mere Journal will be out within a few weeks. The Mere Journal. So the Biddle Allen edition, which was Lewis and Clark until 1904, Jefferson dismisses as the mere narrative. That's just the story. That's not the science. That's not the meteorology. That's not Indian relations. That's not the vocabularies. It's the mere connecting
narrative
story.
Yeah.
And for Jefferson, that means almost nothing. He wants latitude and longitude and Indian vocabularies and ethnographic studies and talk of minerals and talk of plants. So what Biddle Allen did, when you look at the actual journals, Nicholas Biddle, who was the ghostwriter that Clark hired, actually went into the original journals and he took a red pencil and he crossed out the science. That was going to be done later. And so the first edition of Lewis and Clark in 1814 was this mere journal.
Right.
And Jefferson's like, that's not going to appeal to someone like Alexander von Humboldt. I better apologize for that. But also he makes it clear that he's unhappy with Lewis here. And then he says, the measures taken by his surviving companion Clark, he misspells Clark, C-L-A-R-K-E. He never gave William Clark his due. He always regarded him as that guy who was with Lewis, whereas Clark played, as you know, an extremely central role in the success of the expedition. He says, I have no idea when this is all going to come out, but I've kind of heard that the Mere Journal will be out within a few weeks, and it was.
I really enjoyed the book. I don't know that it's a great accessible story for a lot of people, but anybody really interested in Jefferson's character or in Humboldt's, it's a must-read. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, and I want to reinforce something that I know you feel, which is, why isn't Humboldt better known?
There's two things that I was hoping we would get to. The first is a little bit off the mark, maybe, but I said that I've been inspired to go and find his actual journals and read them. I found with great interest, he reported on flora and fauna in detail.
Oh, my, yes.
And he reports finding tomatoes growing.
Oh, here we go.
In South America.
Here we go.
Well, that's where they come from.
That's their source was South America.
Right, yeah, they were little tiny ones, but these had been cultivated, and obviously somebody was working on it. I thought that was...
And of course, that's going to be a connection with Jefferson. I don't know if they talked about the tomato, but
right.
Jefferson's America's tomato guy.
Yeah, so I that was just really fun. But the other thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, in Europe, Humboldt is huge. They still have annual Humboldt festivals, and
there's a Humboldt University.
Societies that study and libraries of his work. And so why don't we... And the question is answered pretty well in this book, and the answer to that question is Darwin.
That he came at the end of the second great period of exploration, with Captain Cook and Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike and so on. And just as he had finished this massive work, Darwin revolutionizes everything by showing that nature is not static. Nature is incredibly dynamic, and that no species can endure in the long run without making significant adjustments to remain viable against all of the other environmental influences and jeopardies and dangers that are outside of it. So there's that. But here's a fun fact, my friend. There are more places named in North America for Alexander von Humboldt than for any other figure, including in a state I once lived in. I lived in Nevada for 17 years. There's the Humboldt River there, and here's what's so fascinating about it. It starts, and then it just stops. It just stops in the middle of the desert. It just dries up. It rolls along for a couple of 100 miles, and then just disappears in the sand, the Humboldt River. The Humboldt Current. He knew everything. He knew about clouds. He's Lewis and Clark plus Fremont plus Zebulon Pike plus a lot of others. And I know in looking at him through the eyes of Jefferson, you just have to think that Jefferson said, where can I get me one of those guys? Why couldn't Lewis have been that guy?
Bursting with energy, bursting with curiosity. And
a ready pen.
And bursting with academic excellence. He could write and all of these things.
David, he got to 19,000 feet in the Andes.
Yeah. Without
oxygen.
And was disappointed because he couldn't reach the top of the volcano.
Gets to 19,000 feet. You know how difficult that is? I mean, this is in snow.
With no
gear.
Modern gear at all.
And, to breathe. This is before this phenomenon began. Mountains in the Alps were not routinely climbed. The whole world of mountain climbing is a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, never more so than now with the kind of traffic jams at Everest and all of that. But going to 19,000 feet in the Andes in 1803 or 4 is almost an unbelievable fact, and he's using it with inadequate footgear. Oh, this is somebody worth knowing. And Andrea Wolfe, who's now a darling at Monticello for her book The Invention of Nature, which I also highly recommend, gave a talk at Monticello in which she talked about following the footsteps of him. She had the glory of a big advance, and and she got to go look at these very places he was.
That's an incredibly readable story.
She's something. She also has founding gardeners,
right?
And a book that I love more than either of those called Chasing Venus, about the transit of Venus. The book on the transit of Venus that occurred twice during Jefferson's lifetime and led in 1761 to Cook's going to Tahiti and creating the whole Tahiti mythology for the West.
There's so much in this book that we haven't touched on that, and we won't have time, but the bit on slavery, the bit on the Haitian Revolution are gone into in great detail and contrasting views. I would say that, Humboldt really did have an appreciation for America. He referred to those 3 days in Washington more than once as the 3 best days of his life. That might have been hyperbole for Jefferson.
I don't think so. I think that, we take this for granted, and I don't mean this in the way that it's going to sound, but most leaders in the history of the world have been unpleasant, ignorant, willful, crazy, capricious, arbitrary, Philistines. Since Plato's Republic, there's been this dream that at some time we're going to get a philosopher prince, or a prince who becomes a philosopher. And in the Enlightenment, Catherine the Great sort of worked at that, and Joseph of Austria tried to become a philosopher prince. This was in the air. But there was one and only actual philosopher prince, although he wasn't a prince in the formal sense of the term, and that was Thomas Jefferson. And the world's most interesting experiment in human liberty, which had been envisioned in Europe, dreamed of in Europe, actually had a chance to take root in America. And so when Humboldt he means this. He's like, this is what humanity has wanted. And finally, in a new world, it's possible. And this is not George Washington or John Adams or even Madison. This is this extraordinary Renaissance man who happens to be president of the United States. So this book is important because with all of this crazy talk about Jefferson and race, Jefferson and Sally Hemings, Jefferson and rape, Jefferson and apartheid, all important. But with all this talk, it's important once in a while to remember he was iconic in the world's idea of what a nation could possibly be and what an enlightened leader could possibly be.
Great conversation. I think we both give this book a thumbs up. But now, sir, we must bring the conversation to a close because it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
And so the summer ends. That may not be a source of melancholy where you live, but up here on the northern Great Plains, we begin to feel a wave of sadness at about 9:30 p.m. now, when it begins to get dark, for the evening light between June 1st and late August is endless. Yesterday morning, I walked out of my front door at 8:30 a.m. and felt that first whiff of autumn in the air. It's a very subtle hint that the first freeze is not so far away, that the leaves will turn golden and start to fall, and people will pull up and seal wrap their boats and RVs, and the whole of the northern plains will brace itself for what Laura Ingalls Wilder called the long winter. We denizens of the northern latitudes have to cram in almost all of our outdoor adventures into 3 months, mid-June to mid-September. To call this season hectic doesn't cover it. It's almost a species of frenzy, perhaps even madness. On a Friday afternoon, if you venture north of Bismarck, North Dakota on US 83, you join a convoy of hundreds, even thousands of pickups hauling fifth-wheel campers and boats and jet skis. It feels like you're heading to a Velveeta Woodstock. People are fleeing the city and heading up to the lake where they will stick their toe in the water and then spend a couple of hours leveling the rig, buying ice, and tuning the satellite dish so they don't have to miss Wheel of Fortune. North Dakotans love many things. One of them is the internal combustion engine. My next-door neighbor, Sean, who is an infinitely more normal North Dakotan than I am, has one of everything. Many cars, a boat, jet skis, an array of lawnmowers, ATVs, snowblowers, leaf blowers, weed whackers, go-karts, you name it. If it can be made to roar and substitute for the muscles of the back or leg, he has it. His carbon footprint is the size of Vermont. Now throw a $2,000 green egg smoking barbecue unit and some cheese-infused bratwursts into the mix, and you have rural America, plus some bottle rockets and Roman candles. For me, it has been a summer of travel and adventure, backpack camping, car camping, horse camping, my week in the Colorado Rockies playing John Steinbeck's younger brother Chip Steinbeck, group camping, 3 days exploring Yellowstone National Park with a bookish friend, a nostalgia journey to Spearfish Canyon in the Black Hills of South Dakota, my auto trip in search of Wall Drug and the world's largest ball of twine, and, of course, my annual Lewis and Clark cultural tour in Montana and Idaho. Frankly, I'm exhausted and ready to settle down to some serious reading and writing. I'm writing a new book about North Dakota and the Great Plains, so I get to call all of this work, even though it has mostly been pure pleasure. I've had a lot of time this summer to drive, hike, gaze at the stars, and just muse, often in the company with some of the people I most prize in the world. Here are a few of my conclusions. Number 1, Gertrude Stein was right. In America, there are more places where nothing is than anything is. There's a lot of empty country out there, much of it absolutely magnificent. In June, I camped high in the Rockies in national forest campgrounds that made me glad and proud to be an American. Beyond the Mississippi River, you can drive forever and not see much except this broad and glorious land stretching out to the horizon in every direction. I drove to Great Falls, Montana on North Dakota and Montana Highway 200 through Sidney, Circle, and Jordan, all puny, nearly dead villages, and there were times when I gasped at how open, endless, big, and swallowing the plains of Montana are. Number 2, thank goodness for Theodore Roosevelt. He's the one who realized we were skinning the land for timber, converting wildlife into cash, throwing up cheap tourist kitsch near the redwoods, the Grand Canyon, and Yosemite, and bringing the buffalo, the elk, the pronghorn antelope, and other majestic quadrupeds to the brink of extinction. During the course of his foreshortened presidency, Roosevelt set aside 230 million acres as permanent national forest, national monument, national wildlife refuge, national game preserve, and national park. No other president accomplished as much. McKinley wouldn't have done it. Taft didn't do it. Wilson actually dismantled some of TR's conservation properties. We owe the fact that we have the greatest national park and federal conservation system to one man, that fragile and sickly boy of New York City, who transformed himself into one of America's greatest exemplars of adventure and the strenuous life by sheer force of will, and then used his enormous charisma and presidential power to save large chunks of the West from extraction and commercial exploitation. Number 3, wilderness is redemptive, restorative, rejuvenating even. The best days of my summer were spent hiking with close friends or just sitting in a canvas chair with a glass of wine at my side and reading for 3, 5, or 8 hours, listening to the breeze in the pines and the cottonwoods, to gaze at the stars out west where there is no civilized light noise, to do all the wondering that Huck and Jim do on the banks of the Mississippi River. Was the stars made, or was they just always there, is one of life's greatest joys. Number 4, there is so much America I don't know. I won't make a list of the national parks I have never been to, the historic sites I have neglected, the locations even on the Lewis and Clark Trail that I don't know very well. If I did nothing for the next 10 years but wander the American West as Chip Steinbeck, I could not see it all or satisfy my lust to feel the heartbeat of this country. And then there's Canada just to the north with equal wonders, and national health care, too. Just as I wonder how I can have reached this age and not read Wuthering Heights or Madame Bovary, how can I have lived in this blessed country and not yet been to Olympic National Park or the Petrified Forest of Arizona? I intend to try to address my geographic ignorance, and I'll take the works of Emily Bronte along. 5. Finally, this is a much happier, more harmonious, kinder, gentler, more generous, and more unified country than you could ever know by watching Fox or MSNBC. We are actually mostly thriving as a people. Of course there are problems, some very serious, some critically serious problems. But if you get out into the heartland and just survey humankind, you, or at least I, inevitably cheer up. There is so much more that is right with America than is wrong with it. And my goodness, we do fuss about a lot of things that are not really worthy of human fixation. A night at Itasca State Park in northern Minnesota at the source of the Mississippi River will make you fall in love with America all over again. And those two great men, Jefferson, who purchased the Louisiana Territory from Bonaparte sight unseen, and Theodore Roosevelt, who understood that the greatest therapy in life is sitting around a campfire as it pops and snorts and glows late into the evening. Summer ebbs now. School's back in session. The cottonwoods in the Badlands reveal the first nip of frost in outlying limbs whose leaves have already turned to gold. I have not yet sat in the Little Missouri River this summer. It has been running full, but I mean to correct that before I hang up my hiking boots for the long, long, long winter on the northern Great Plains. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2787. 888-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.